Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Peggy Lowe, and I'm the rector of St. Albans Episcopal Church here in Austin. I'm also the board president here at Episcopal Parish Network, where the church gathers. We're happy to welcome you to this workshop examining the global inaction in response to the ongoing crisis in the Sudan. Just a couple procedural items before I turn everything over to our panel. First, the session is being recorded. And you will receive an email with a link to the recording and any additional materials provided by the panelists once they post to our website's workshop library. We try to get this out within 24 to 48 hours. Also, the Q&A function is disabled for all our workshops. Please enter your questions in the chat, and the panel will answer them during and after the session as time permits. A transcript of the chat will also be available alongside the recording. Again, thank you all for being here. I'm now happy to, now I'm going to invite Declan Walsh to introduce himself and help set the tone for this conversation. Thank you, Declan.
Thanks very much, Peggy. So my name is Declan Walsh. I'm a reporter with the New York Times. I'm the chief Africa correspondent based in Nairobi, but for the last year and a half, certainly, I think the vast majority of my work has focused on Sudan. And I've visited the country several times and written a number of long pieces for the Times about the war from inside the country and also from neighboring countries. I was most recently I'd like to start with my most recent trip to Sudan, which was back in March. I went there with photographer Ivor Prickett, whose powerful photographs illustrated many of the pieces that we've written. Yeah, and we arrived at this moment of really, truly dramatic change in the city. After 2 years of quite intense fighting, Khartoum was suddenly changing hands. The Sudanese military was sweeping across the city, and it was pushing out its foe, the Rapid Support Forces, from the city. And as we arrived in places in parts of the city that the Sudanese military had just captured or recaptured, people would rush out onto the streets to cheer the soldiers, and sometimes people cheered us as well. And I was a little puzzled about this sometimes, and I asked one woman why. And in response, she said to me it was partly because we were the first outsiders that she had seen after 2 years of life in this really desperate war zone. But she also said it was because they felt forgotten. It's been incredibly hard to get attention for this war in Sudan, despite the enormous scale of the fighting and the immense suffering that it has wrought. The fall of Khartoum, or the changes that took place in Khartoum, only some months ago, back in March, really seemed to signal some very tentative hope that the war was maybe taking a turn towards in a new direction that might, at the very least, encourage the warring sides to sue for peace, to move towards diplomacy. But unfortunately, things since then have even gotten worse. Some weeks after the Sudanese military quite triumphantly claimed the capture of Khartoum, or the recapture of Khartoum, their foe, the Rapid Support Forces, carried out this fierce barrage of drone strikes on Port Sudan, which is the de facto wartime capital of the country, where the military and what's left of the government has been based, destroying fuel depots, hitting airstrips, and really showing that even though this group has been pushed out of Khartoum, it has an ability to carry out these strikes from bases hundreds of miles away, effectively spanning one of Africa's largest countries. Since then, the fighting has moved to new parts of the country, to the Kordofans, which is close to Darfur. It has also spread to very remote areas in the desert, in the northwestern desert, along the border with Libya. And the suffering of Sudanese people, the humanitarian crisis, is only deepening. So far, a couple of brief statistics, over 14 million people have been forced from their homes by this war. About half the population faces starvation. You've got entire cities that have been reduced to rubble. One side in the fighting has been accused of genocide. The other side has also been accused of war crimes, including indiscriminate bombings of busy marketplaces. Cholera has now spread to every state in Sudan except for one, and access to Sudan is access is severely obstructed by both warring factions. So that's a picture of where the war is at now in the humanitarian situation. I'm just going to turn briefly to a little sketch of the bigger picture of the conflict. The drones that I mentioned a moment ago that the RSF used to carry out those strikes in Port Sudan were a sign of how this war went from what in the early stages of the war was just commonly described as a power struggle between either between two rival generals at the top of the chain in Sudan, or certainly between two, the two most powerful factions in the Sudanese military apparatus. Now it has become a war that depends not just on intra-Sudanese fights, but also on the influence of foreign powers. Those drones that the RSF flew, as our reporting has indicated, were supplied by the United Arab Emirates. That's the Gulf country that is the main backer for the rapid support forces. On the other side of the fight, you've got the Sudanese military, which has acquired drones from Turkey and from Russia. It's acquired military support from it's certainly acquired financial support from countries like Saudi Arabia. And of course, Russia has also piled in, offering weapons in exchange for benefits that we don't really know about. But broadly speaking, it shows us that this has now become a proxy war to some degree between these very powerful outside countries who have their own interests in the war. The diplomatic efforts to try and end this fighting are largely stalled or dead. The African Union, unfortunately, has been highly ineffective. European countries are divided about the war. The sort of dizzying number of peace initiatives that were underway last year now seem to have largely subsided. And the RSF recently, just some weeks ago, announced that it had formed its own parallel government in Nyala in South Darfur. From the American perspective, the Trump administration has been pretty ineffective on this conflict since President Trump has come into office. But there has been a little bit of change recently. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, after leading a peace deal in the Democratic Republic of Congo, announced that Sudan would be next. And that has, I would say, brought some cautious hopes that we might be about to see greater engagement in Washington. There's also been meetings that the US government has hosted with ambassadors from some of the Arab countries that are involved in this conflict, namely the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. And so there have been some reports recently that there may be about to be a more concerted push from the Trump administration. But so far, we've seen very little. And, it's very hard to know, how engaged the Trump administration is on the ground. Part of the problem under the Biden administration was that, or certainly some analysts will say that under the Biden administration, there was a lot of folks at a mid and senior level of the administration who were very engaged on Sudan, people like Tom Perriello, who's going to be speaking to you soon. But at the very top level of the US government, there wasn't enough engagement. To some degree, with the Trump administration, we're seeing suggestion that it may even be, we may have the opposite problem, that we've got people at Secretary of State level announcing at least an intention to get involved in Sudan, but it's very unclear how many people are left inside the State Department with deep knowledge of Sudan who are able to engage on the file right now. And then the last part of the picture I'd just like to point to is really I think it's very important to consider Sudan, the conflict in Sudan now in the regional context. For months now, there have been really serious tensions brewing in the Horn of Africa between the leaders of Ethiopia and Eritrea. There's almost a sense of inevitability among some Ethiopians that some sort of war is looming between those two countries. And it's very unclear, of course, prognostication or predicting the future is foolish, but it is certainly very worrisome. it's a very worrisome prospect that should a war erupt, another large war erupt in the Horn of Africa, that would in turn have further consequences for the war, unpredictable and probably grave consequences for the war in Sudan. And so I think that's something that, as reporters, we're going to be looking at closely. And I think everyone who's got the interests of Sudan at heart will be monitoring closely as well.
Thank you very much, Declan. I'm delighted to join you a little bit late. I think we should move directly on to Manal Taha, who is an expert on conflict, a Sudanese-American now, who has done a great deal of work on as an anthropologist and otherwise on conflict dissection. So please, Manal, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk here. Thank you so much, Declan. You provided a very good overview about what's happening and why. And I want to go to why it's happening more than what's happening now, because as I said, Dan said, I'm an anthropologist, so usually I like to do analysis behind these issues. So I want to just start by telling the audience that Sudan, one of the rare countries that experienced genocides in less than 20 years. 2 genocides eventually, 2023 and 2003 and 2023, and in one place in Darfur. But the conflict is everywhere. So, and I want to tell the audience that our first war started our first war in this national before the independence, started before independence, 1952, when the South Sudan revolt against what's happening in Sudan, in the country. And since then, we never had a time that we lived in peace without war somewhere in the country, except for a short period. And we had a lot of peace agreements. And all of these peace agreements, it didn't stay for longer. It didn't hold it for longer for us to take a breath and to experience peace and prospect and safe and sustain peace and just like prospect and peace and safety and security. And that's for me is for many reasons. First, we know that history taught us that genocide is cycled back. It's cycled back all the ways. And genocide and conflicts is not just an event, it's a process. So when we're trying to deal with our conflicts and war, we should also deal with processes. And that is what is lacking in our peace agreements. So processes, how we can make sure that we have processes that start with public consultation, start with national dialogue, start with peace dialogues itself among different groups. That is what actually is lacking in all of our peace processes. Just going for what's happening now, my fears is like after now we have as the Delcan said that we had some attempts in the past and now for some peace processes or for some ceasefire. My own intake, if it's going to go with the same process or the same way it went before, it's going to collapse. It will 2 or 3 months, it will collapse. And usually we experience in Sudan, when it collapses ugly. The people will be dying hundreds more than before. So I want to say like our war evolve and expanded. And why, then the question, why this war never stopped? Why this cycle never stopped? And I want to go for peace deals. Let me say peace deals. Most of these peace deals was actually, if it's initiated outside the country with international communities. And usually our peace deal is elite-centered peace talks. And the international community will find themselves trapped on in the issue of the transaction deal of wealth and power distributions. And my fears is this is gonna happen again, And whenever it happens, we're going to be ready for another war. That's our story. The peace deal we had it never addressed our trauma, our Sudanese trauma, never addressed it. Never addressed the wound that we had it through generations. We have generation trauma, like from generations to generations. We never had the time to experience peace so we can reconcile. We never had security, we never had a transitional justice started or processed. We had no single trial court that happened for any crimes happened during our war. If it is rape, or it's sexual abuse, or with killing, or with mass killing, or war crime, or even genocide. We never had any national, somebody was being in a jail because he did that. Never. Imagine, this is like 77 years of fighting, 77 years of killing. So that's what's happening. This is our reality. So why is that happening again and again and again? Is first, our peace deal is lacking of processes. All of them, they lack of processes. Our conflict is processes. It has a lot of processes. It doesn't happen in a night. Okay, and then another things also we should be care of. The peace agreements is usually being initiated by international community, but this international community they trap to this transaction quick deal with this elite centered, usually elites from politicians or security actors. Also, the peace agreements it's being taken by these armed groups and security is as a chance to co-opt. Okay, to co-opt like it's itself to co-opt it's being used to co-opt the armed group themselves. So to co-opt them, to give them some of the cake so they can really stop fighting, and then tomorrow they will be ready. And they never implement any security sector reform or any disarmament, or never happened in Sudan, because this is a power. In the history in Sudan, we glorified the armed struggle for a long time after the Cold War. This has been glorified, never been addressed as a problem for the instability in these countries. And ironically, these armed struggle fought the dictator for 30 years. But when young people and women came out in peaceful movement, they took him away. They removed him. That means still we are glorifying and trying to upgrade the voice of men in uniform, men in arms, instead of young and women that actually, by their voices and their belief, they took the dictators off. So this is one of the problem we had in Sudan. And then also the features that share with all these peace process, the absence of women and youth. They make the revolution. They go out for justice. They call for justice. They take the very heat of war, but being absent from peace process. They may put them in trap too. Okay, but when it comes to ceasefire, they've been excluded, because the international community will listen to the men in arms, and always they have arms, they have weapons. They will listen to a government, to political elites, to security actors. They will not listen to those men and women and men who are peacefully demonstrated. The mediators themselves, when they go to mediate, they will not take the women and the young people with them as the expert and work with them inside the room and to face and to empower them in front of those armed group or security actors or politicians. Okay, they will meet with them outside the room, aside the room, but they will never take their hands, say I'm a mediator, I have 1325, I signed for it, I have to be with those women in the room talking to you. Because when women in the room, they will bring the issue of rape. We have hundreds of women raped, okay, in this war. We had hundreds of women raped in 2003 in Darfur, in Nuba Mountain. So it's a generations through generations, abuse through abuse. That needs to be addressed. And the only people will address it is women. Okay, not only the rape. People, we have 17 million students out of school. We don't have a school running now. Our children to go to school to have the exam, they will travel miles, hundreds, thousands of miles, crossing arms groups just to sit for exam. We don't have water, we don't have electricity, let alone the health. So this is the issue that women will bring in the table, changing the course and the context of the peace agreements itself, instead of being wealth and money distributions and power distributions, how many ministers you have, the talks should be different. The narrative should be different in the room. The change that we wanted and we requested and we want to advocate for it and want you also to advocate for it with us is when we talk about Sudan peace, we talk about how many children out of school, how many, because of this war, how many schools is being destroyed, how many people were being slaughtered, how many girls were being raped, 1 year, 2 years, 11 years, and pregnant. So that is when we bring that in the room of the talk, okay, that we're going to humanize Sudanese in front of those armed groups, in front of those military, so they will feel us. At least they will stop, okay, they will not continue. That's the way we humanize, and that's the way we can change the discourse and the way we type this fight. So if we don't do that, believe me, the White House will have a meeting now. Okay, the President Trump may reach for some peace agreements, but they will fight after 4 months, because it's about wealth and power struggle. And always, we don't have a lot of resources. So they're going to fight over these few resources left. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Manal, for giving us that glimpse into the process as they have gone on for decades, the exclusive attention of the elites to getting peace, and the omission of important groups like the women. So now we're going to turn to Ambassador Tom Perriello, who was the envoy for the Biden administration, a very energetic envoy, I might add, and also has continued to try to mobilize support for an ending of the war. So thank you, Tom, for being on this program.
Thank you, Dane. And I'm going to begin and end with an ask, which is that I hope everyone on this call will click on that link I just sent, mutualaidsudan.org, and make a contribution before the end of this phone call, and email or text at least one friend to contribute to mutualaidsudan.org. There are many great causes. I'll talk more about this one in a second. But every single dollar is going directly to life-saving aid on the front lines. And this is a Sudanese-led effort. And I think one of the things that I have seen in Sudan, which I also saw when I was inside Ukraine during the early months of the war, is in Sudanese local people leading efforts and risking their lives, and in many cases losing their lives, in order to get food and medicine into the most hard-to-reach areas. This works with a lot of those mutual aid groups. Andrea Tracy's on the call, who's played an instrumental role working with the Sudanese. It includes the emergency response room networks and others. And I start with that in part because people are dying right now, and regardless of everything else that's been said, which is so important, and I'll reinforce much of it, we are in a situation that is life and death. In fact, I've never been part of a crisis this large in my lifetime that's received this little attention. And second, because a lot of what you're going to hear today is pretty depressing, and that can be paralyzing. And we don't need your paralysis right now. We need your action. So one of those concrete things you can do within your parish, within your personal networks, alumni networks, friends, neighborhoods, get people maybe to adopt one of the emergency response rooms, make some small contributions each week. It is absolutely a matter of life and death. And both Manal and Declan spoke to the scale of it. We're talking about tens of millions of people. And really the scaled approaches have not been working. And that means these national networks, often of youth-led, women-led, are making that difference. I'll come back to that ask, but please, I will not be offended by you being distracted. I will be very pleased if you use this time to make a contribution and maybe ping a few people about it. With that being said, I do want to really thank the Episcopal Parish Network for shining a light on Sudan. As Declan mentioned, it really has been very difficult to get the world's attention on a crisis, despite the fact that it is of such epic scale, both in terms of the scale of starvation and hunger, but also the scale of atrocities, including rape and sexual slavery, including using those weapons of war. And we're well into the third year of that suffering, and really many decades in, depending on when you start the clock. I also want to thank Declan Walsh. His introduction was understated, but not only did he win a Pulitzer Prize along with his team for their work on Sudan, it's been some of the most impactful, cutting edge work in that area. I appreciate the New York Times choosing to put it on the front page a couple of times. I know when I was working as the lead diplomat for the Biden administration, it made an impact when those stories would land. And certainly Manal has been a great academic and practitioner, bringing an understanding of the ideas that are necessary with the reality of these discussions. Because we probably want to get to questions, I won't do a whole lot more on the analysis of the conflict. What I will acknowledge is one of the reasons it's been hard to get people to engage in this conflict is it doesn't fit a neat narrative. I think when we're all a little bit exhausted with pain and suffering around the world, and in some cases pretty depressed about issues in our own country, this is not on one level something that seems like it's a good side and a bad side. It's two bad sides, or a bad side and a worse side. Early in the conflict, I think there was a stronger sense that the protagonist of this war, the good guy, was the revolution itself. It was this incredibly inspiring moment when the Sudanese people rose up to throw off Bashir and finally began a process to inclusive democracy. And that is certainly universally what you hear from Sudanese that they want to get back to. But the nature of conflict, particularly as it goes on, is it tends to be polarizing. And that's even more so in an era of social media, when there's a lot of propaganda and misinformation that's blurring the lines, compared to, say, when I was working on Darfur and spent some time in Darfur 20 plus years ago during the genocide. It was a different moment in the world. It was a different moment in the United States. Things like labeling the then Janjaweed, which is at least in part a precursor to the RSF, genocidaires, meant something, and that broke through policy. We're in a different era now. We can analyze all of that. But really what I want to emphasize most is action. And I will say we do continue to have bipartisan support. It's not necessarily as deep or as robust as we would want, but we continue to have Republican and Democratic senators that care a lot about this. Secretary Rubio really comes out of that tradition. And the bar is set so low for advocacy on Sudan right now that even a few phone calls can make a difference. Thinking about when your member of Congress or senator is home in August for recess, having even a single visit from your parish. One of several things we're trying to push right now is to get 70% of the humanitarian aid going into Sudan to go to these mutual aid efforts, these Sudanese-led efforts that tend to go a lot further dollar for dollar. Obviously, we've been trying very much to protect the aid going into Sudan. That's a lot of what I've been doing the last 6 months, is behind the scenes trying to protect that bipartisan consensus. But so many programs have been shut down or thrown into chaos. So I think we need to hit this on 3 levels. We need those individual donations to come in directly to the emergency response rooms that were nominated for a Nobel Prize and other mutual aid efforts. Again, mutualaidsudan.org is, I think, one of the most efficient ways to support that. We need to make sure the U.S. government and the UN continue to make Sudan more of a priority and ideally move a higher percentage of those donations over. And then in addition to that, we have the much more complicated issue of how we get ceasefire talks going. Certainly in a perfect world, they would happen very much along the lines that Manal discussed. We are in a far from perfect world now, and it's a little harder for individuals and individual parishes necessarily to affect that. But I think what we can do is just even calls saying we care about Sudan, we want to see solutions in Sudan, helps to bolster and reinforce that bipartisan consensus here. And I will say there are some opportunities. I think people have countries in the region have been able to focus a lot on sort of blaming the United States for this or that, and many of those criticisms are fair. But with a shift and frankly a reduction in U.S. leadership, it has led some of the regional actors potentially to understand that they're going to have to get together to work with the Sudanese to find solutions. Of course, which Sudanese is a big part of that. So rather than get into too much of the policy discussion, I really want to just say that I can't emphasize enough how little attention there is on Sudan, and therefore how much even a few actions on your part can make a big difference. So whether that's contacting your members of Congress, whether that's raising a few dollars from your friends, parish neighbors into something like Mutual Aid Sudan or other things, all of those things matter, and I think prayers are certainly welcome in this case as well. So we'll dig into more of it, but again, appreciate Declan and Manal for their unique work, and hope to be available for conversation and questions after that. Thank you very much, Dane.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your impassioned continued work on this problem. I think it would be a little bit useful to, as we begin to move toward the end of this program, for a little bit more discussion of the other states that are involved here and how we move them along. We know who they are, but a little bit more on the process, perhaps Tom coming back in along with Declan and Manal on how do we get the parties, particularly those in the Gulf, engaged and perhaps find an off-ramp for the United Arab Emirates, which has been a major factor in keeping this going. Could you speak a little bit more about that, please?
So is that to me, Dane?
It's to both of you, but you started.
Sure,
So
I'm happy to kick it off. Yeah, I mean, again, just briefly recapping, you know, a huge part of the problem of the challenge of, of resolving the war in Sudan, to my mind anyway, is the fact that it has become so internationalized with so many foreign players. And there's little doubt that while other countries like Russia and Iran are playing an important role as suppliers of weapons or as allies to the Sudanese military, it is really on the political and also on the military front to some degree, Gulf countries that are just playing an outsized role in this conflict. As you correctly identified, I think, you know, by far the most important Gulf actor is the United Arab Emirates, just because they have been supporting in many different ways, but principally with military equipment, the RSF since the early days of the war, really. But we're increasingly seeing, Saudi Arabia, which has principally been on the diplomatic field, but probably also giving some perhaps financial support to the Sudanese military. And we're also seeing Qatar returning to the fold to some degree as well this year, providing support again for the military. So, you know, the danger here is that we see not just weapons flowing into the country and fueling the fighting, but also the prospect of the rivalries, the Gulf rivalries between these countries are also going to play out, you know, in a proxy way through that war in Sudan, and so that's a huge challenge. You asked a question about what can be done or what sort of pressure can be exerted. There are efforts by campaigners. There have been some efforts to try and particularly turn up the heat on the Emirates. Last year, there was a a major entertainer, a rap star, who cancelled his concert in Dubai on account of what he had learned about the war in Sudan and the Emirati role in that. There was some, I would say, some quite light pressure to cancel on two NBA teams. I think it was the Denver Nuggets and the Boston Celtics, who were playing a couple of matches in the United Arab Emirates, and there was a little bit of pressure from activists to try and force those teams to reconsider. That didn't happen. And I think broadly speaking, but I think, largely speaking, to be honest, I think that activism has not been super effective, but we have seen signs that, the Emirates has felt, some degree of discomfort for the reputational damage that country is suffering as a result of its involvement in this war. I meet foreign, I mean, among the people I meet, we also meet many foreign diplomats who are, behind the scenes trying to find a path to diplomacy. And recently I met one who told me that, one of the challenging things is that when they meet representatives from the Emirates, even in private settings, the Emiratis continue to flat out deny any culpability, any involvement in the war. They deny they're supporting either side. And I think for governments and for diplomats, it's become very hard to find a way to have an open conversation about that. But, political pressure is important. And the Trump administration, as I said earlier, really hasn't shown a strong direction so far. There are some prospects that might change, but of course, the Trump administration has shown that it is, prizes a sort of version of commercial diplomacy until now. Even the peace deal that it brokered in DR Congo included a component that would advantage American mining interests in Congo. Now, there's an entirely separate debate about whether that is ultimately the best way to go about these things. I'm putting that aside, but I just want to make the point that I just don't know if given that the Trump administration has a lot of close ties with the Emirates, is it willing to at the same time turn pressure up on the Emirates to stop its activities in Sudan? We just don't know. It is notable that just before in his confirmation hearing, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said some pretty strong things about the Emirati role in the war. But since he's been in office, he seems to have rowed back to some degree on that. And it's going to be pretty important to watch in the coming, in the coming months to see whether the administration really does take up the Sudan case in a more purposeful way.
Tom, thank you very much, Declan. That was quite interesting the way you dissected it. Tom, I wonder, since you were in the midst of this, trying to put together those governments from the Gulf, if you would talk a little bit more about the complexities of that and where you see that going forward, I think that would be very useful.
I'm happy to do so, but it looked like Manal might have something to come in on. Manal, did you want to come in on Declan's point first?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah. Actually, I want to add something to Declan, and I want to say that this war opened our eyes as the Sudanese for how much we are interacted and with the other regional power, how actually they can influence the decisions inside Sudan, and how complex this relationship. And the reality is that I woke up is how actually we are interconnected with what's happening in the Middle East. That's not being discussed a lot. How Sudan actually, what's happening in Sudan is straightforward connected with what's happening in the whole region in the Middle East. And I want to talk about from geopolitical interest for the US here and for other countries or international trade, in terms of why Sudan is important, why stability in Sudan is important. Sudan lies behind the Red Sea. We have a big shore of the Red Sea, and that is a key important security corridor for the international trade. 20% of the international trade goes through that Red Sea. 10% of the US trade, it goes through the Red Sea. So Sudan lies on this importance. it doesn't really, it's not disconnected from the whole region, what's happening in the Gulf, in the Middle East, and what's happening in Palestine, in Israel, all that's interconnected. So that is a new reality for us as a Sudanese, and it's an old reality, but a new awareness for us. I want to say that there is a process needs to be taken place now, and to have an international community to walk into our Sudanese door and say, I want to help you to do peace agreements is not something new for us. That is our norms. But we want this time to be different, and we want it to take a different processes. So, and this process will start by informing whoever involved on this peace process about the context. But also it has another things, it should not, we have, as Sudanese, we have our own homework. We need to work locally to decrease the level of tension and this politicized identity and ethnic issues, and dealing with our hate in the social media, for us to pave the way for peace. Then, of course, we walk up with a lot of regional countries that interfere in our countries. They have an interest in their countries, but everybody has interests and needs. It should be taken in a very respectful for the sovereignty of the other country, of our independence, our own stability and peace. Sudan never reject any outsider to deal with them in peaceful and respect way. So it's better strategically to deal with the Sudan and with the stable Sudan, with unified Sudan, than with broken Sudan. The experience in all countries around on the globe, there is no economic interest being conducted in a good way in a broken country, in a collapsed state. It never happened. So that is the way, that's our leverage we have it with the international community. And I hope if there's any peace coming now, and we see it happening now in the White House, but it's a closed door. Ministers, they will come talk. I hope they will consult local Sudanese. I hope they will bring Sudanese voices here with them. I hope they will work with us as a Sudanese women and young people and youth. Otherwise, they will go with the generals. And the generals, they have this big bunch of money and ministers and gold, our cares, they want to distribute. So that's what I can take is take care of process, because our war is a process. We need our peace to be a process as well. Thank you.
So let me make three quick interventions on that. So the first is picking up something the great Stephen Miles has raised in the chat about how to adopt an ERR. My advice would be to work through Mutual Aid Sudan. It's been set up by Proximity to Humanity to solve two problems. One is the due diligence 501c3 tax deductible issue on the US end, but the other is all of the drama and coalition politics of the mutual aid groups on the other end. So there's now a leadership council, there's an ERR process, and I think whether, first either just giving into that or consulting through them to figure out the best way to do that. I know Andrea Tracy's on the line, and I think one of the Sudanese leads, if you guys can text that in. So I think that, you can also go directly. There's some other networks to work with on that. But I know that's been two things we've run into with US-based donors, whether small or large, is on the one hand, how do you kind of meet that minimum threshold? And then on the other hand, how do you make sure it's getting to the right place? So I think they've done a really good job of that, and working with them would be good. Second, I want to just pick up on something that an additional factor about the Gulf engagement than Declan and Manal was saying, which is not just the direct issue, but one of the things that has really shifted in my professional career was in the sort of late 90s and aught years, you had a lot more voices of African heads of state and African civil society speaking up for saying the atrocities must end, there should be more attention paid. Many of those, particularly the most influential African countries, are currently in so many financial dealings with different Gulf countries they would say it's not corruption. They would say we want to not just be seen as the atrocity police. We want to be seen as the financial, a place for financial and capital investment. But you've certainly seen that impact, most notably in terms of countries not speaking out against the role of the Emirates, some even seeming to be cozy to an RSF that they earlier would have seen as particularly targeting and attacking African tribes. But you also saw it with our difficulty in trying to move the diplomatic negotiations out of the Jeddah process. The African countries and others were very upset that the talks were happening in Jeddah rather than having more African leadership. But when we went multiple times and said, hey, we're ready to move them here, it was often the answer was, well, we don't want to upset the Saudis in addition to that. So I think understanding the way in which the Gulf politics are not just directly affecting dynamics inside Sudan, but also have a bank shot effect, certainly on US administrations, but also in the African dynamic. I'm going to put a pause because I can see Dane wants to move us on to the third point, which is that I do think that this question of the tactics that used to help us center civilians, that used to use people-powered politics, the bad actors around the world have gotten extremely good at decimating the things that were working in the 90s and the aught years. And some of that is self-imposed by progressives in the US and around the world, where we cannot seem to speak with one voice. So there's a much longer conversation about how it is that we've moved backwards on what seemed to be a trend towards understanding the need, for example, to center civilians and more marginalized voices. But that backwards movement is very, very real, even before this change of administrations, and certainly since then. And that comes back to this issue that the politics are going to be hard to solve. Certainly, I want people to engage in that. But in the meantime, we do have Sudanese that are risking their lives every day. So the more we can show them some solidarity and support, I think we can build out coalitions from there.
Thank you, Tom. I want to salute Manal for talking about the Red Sea and the importance of the Red Sea for international trade and the way that ties into Sudan's complicated relationship over the decades with the Gulf countries and, of course, with Egypt. It's a very complicated thing, and it makes it much more difficult getting the peace. I think I'd like to say just a word about why AFRECS is involved in this. We are AFRECS, the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of the Sudans. We were created 20 years ago to support the peace-building priorities of the Episcopal Church of Sudan. And since the independence of South Sudan, the Episcopal Church of Sudan and the Episcopal Church of South Sudan. AFRECS has been providing emergency aid for internally displaced persons in Sudan and for refugees going into South Sudan through those churches. And it's very interesting to point out that it is possible to assist people in the Sudan through the app which the Bank of Sudan has created called Bankak, so that funds that are sent to an account in the Bank of Sudan for AFRECS or Humanity United can go directly to people on the line through the magic of cell phones. So you don't need to think about, well, if I give my money, is it going to be delayed for a long time? Through Bankak, it will not be delayed. And I want to say that it seems to me extremely important that what you can do is to get in touch with your members of Congress and tell them how serious you are about getting this conflict resolved. Talk to them continuously, stress the importance of action. There is a bipartisan interest in this problem. Senators Rounds and the senator from New Jersey sponsored legislation. In addition to that, Representative Gregory Meeks who is the ranking House member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has announced a joint resolution of disapproval to block U.S. weapons sales to the United Arab Emirates. It's important to get behind these people and tell them that that is what you want. And in addition, to give funds, as Tom has indicated, through Bangkok. These funds can be transferred immediately to the field to the emergency response rooms. And I urge you to think about giving to proximity to humanity, as Tom has talked about, but also to AFRECS at AFRECS.org. We are transferring those funds directly to Episcopal churches, which are able to give funds directly to people in their churches without regard to whether they are Christian or Muslim, without regard to which church they belong to. You can also give to Save the Children. You can give to MSF, Doctors Without Borders, and of course UNICEF and UNHCR, the UN Relief Agency, who are very much involved in this effort. So Tom or Declan or Manal, please come in on this briefly. We could talk about it for a minute or two.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken a few times to some of the ways to give, so I don't know if Declan, it looked like you might want to come on that and add in, and then I come in behind what you had.
To add on what? Sorry, I'm sorry, Tom. I just meant to add on
Places actions that you think are making a difference, whether it's things you're seeing that are making a difference on, congressional or the United Nations or humanitarian efforts on the ground, I think was sort of where we're trying to land people here.
Yeah, there are. I've certainly seen firsthand on the ground. We've spoken a lot about the work of, or you guys have spoken about the work of the emergency response rooms, which is incredibly impressive, certainly in Khartoum, but in many parts of the country. I know those folks are under a huge amount of pressure right now since the change in hands in Khartoum. I think there are elements in the Sudanese military that are not friendly to civilians who are prominent in the revolution in 2019. So I think as well as money, groups like that also need, political support, frankly, to continue doing the work that they're doing. But there's so many other aid groups. There's several aid groups I would single out that I've seen doing absolutely incredible work in the most difficult circumstances. Usual suspects like Doctors Without Borders, certainly some church groups, and also the Italian NGO Emergency that has continued a hospital in Khartoum throughout the war. But I gotta say, the UN system is much maligned and of course, in great trouble in many respects. But I think I would say that, being in refugee areas in Chad, you see agencies that, with limited resources are often doing their best to try and deliver services to people in really the most desperate circumstances. And again, a little bit to the contemporary political changes in the US. I think since the dismantling of USAID and the huge impact that that's had on some of these operations, we've recently seen the emergence of contracting groups that have started to propose their services, effectively not just picking up USAID contracts, but also seeking to somewhat replace some of the work that the UN is doing. That's still at a very incipient stage. There's been some reporting about it already. We've looked into it. We haven't really written about it yet. Other publications have, the Washington Post and others. But I think for those folks on this call who are, well informed and engaged about these issues, about getting help in Sudan, I think it's a development that's worth noting, and of course people striving to ensure that however aid is delivered, that is done in a way that is effective and that is reaching the people that need it most.
I'm going to say a little bit about the question I posed about the impact on South Sudan. It's been quite extensive, particularly the flow of refugees from Sudan into South Sudan. over about 1 million people going into South Sudan and putting pressure on that country. In addition, the war has halted the flow of oil for most of the time, the flow of South Sudanese oil out of Port Sudan. It is alleged that there's been some pressure by the Sudan armed forces on the disorder going in Upper Nile in South Sudan. But the South Sudan also provides some access to the Nuba Mountain area, which is in a famine stage for aid. So some aid has been going across there. And the Episcopal Church of South Sudan has provided great support to Archbishop Ezekiel Kondo, the Archbishop, the primate of Sudan. So the impact has been extensive and goes both ways. I would really like to thank our panelists today, Manal Taha, for her insights into leading us through the processes that have gone over time and the need to get larger groups rather than having the elites run the peace process, get the women and youth back into the process, get the civilians who have shown such incredible resourcefulness and courage in this process. I want to thank Declan for his beginning for his remarkable reporting on Sudan, which was so insightful for all of us who've been following this from day to day, and that he would come on this program from Nairobi. Congratulations again on his Pulitzer Prize. And Tom Perriello, who continues to be, not only was an indefatigable envoy for the Biden administration, but continues to work to mobilize support for getting a solution to this problem. We're deeply grateful that you could work with us. Thank you very much.